A cold tremor slithered through the city's underbelly in the spring of 1948. Not the usual kind that came with rivalries or turf wars, but a deeper, more unsettling dread. 7 waitresses, each from a different, unassuming diner across the 5 boroughs, vanished without a trace in a single, brutal week. No witnesses, no ransom notes, just empty aprons draped over abandoned chairs and the faint, lingering scent of fear. Their disappearances were a phantom limb to the city, a collective gasp swallowed by the concrete maw of New York. But what truly froze the blood of those in the know wasn't just the vanishing act itself, but the chilling whisper that followed, carried on the grimy wind from the docks to the gleaming towers. He's back. For a decade, Don Luciano the Labyrinth Ricci had been a ghost, a legend whispered in hushed tones, believed to be either dead, imprisoned, or living out his days in quiet exile. His sudden, monstrous return, marked by the abduction of these innocent women, ripped open old wounds and ignited a terror that seeped into every shadowed alleyway and every whispered conversation. The core mystery that still haunts the city's forgotten archives and the fractured memories of its oldest families is this. Why did Don Luciano, a man who commanded legions and whose name alone could bring empires to their knees, resurface only to abduct 7 ordinary women and then force one, a quiet girl named Elena, to become his bride? The stakes were not just the lives of these women, but the very soul of the city itself. Elena, a young woman with a spirit as fragile as porcelain, but a will as unyielding as the cobblestones she walked, found herself trapped in a nightmare beyond imagining. Her tormentor, Don Luciano, was a man whose eyes held the cold, calculating glint of a predator. Yet beneath the surface, a twisted genius for strategy and control simmered. His empire, once thought crumbled, was now reasserting itself with a chilling precision, and Elena was but a pawn in a game whose rules were written in blood and fear. To truly comprehend the horrifying tableau of 1948, the resurgence of a ghost, and the tragic fate of 7 innocent lives, we must rewind the clock back through the years of silence and speculation to the harsh, unforgiving winter of 1938. That was the year Don Luciano Ricci, a man whose shadow stretched long and menacing over the city, disappeared from the face of the earth, leaving behind a power vacuum and a legacy of terror that would forever scar the city's memory. The story begins not with a bang, but with a chilling, prolonged silence, a decade of absence that only amplified the horror of his return. The very notion that he could have been alive, plotting, waiting in the wings, was a thought too terrifying for most to even entertain. Yet, as the 7 waitresses vanished, one by one, the city was forced to confront the unspeakable. Each abduction was a carefully orchestrated move, a brutal reintroduction of a man who had perfected the art of disappearing and reappearing at will, leaving only chaos and fear in his wake. The questions surrounding his initial vanishing were now overshadowed by the desperate need to understand his grotesque return. What twisted purpose fueled this decade-long hiatus, and what did it have to do with these 7 unsuspecting women? The answers lay hidden in the labyrinthine corridors of the city's criminal past, a past that was now bleeding into the present with terrifying force. The year was 1938. The city, a sprawling beast of ambition and grit, was still reeling from the tremors of the Great Depression. But for Don Luciano Ricci, the economic downturn was merely an inconvenience, a distraction for lesser men. His empire, built on the foundations of Prohibition-era bootlegging, illegal gambling, and a network of ruthless enforcers, was a well-oiled machine, churning out power and profit with chilling efficiency. His mansion, a brooding stone edifice on the Upper East Side, stood as a silent testament to his dominion, its shadowed windows observing the city with an almost predatory gaze. Inside, the air was perpetually thick with the scent of expensive cigars, fear, and a faint metallic tang that hinted at unseen atrocities. Don Luciano was not a man of grand pronouncements or flamboyant displays. His power was in his silence, his unpredictability, and the cold, unblinking intensity of his gaze. He moved like a phantom. His presence felt more than seen, his decisions final and unappealable. His disappearance, therefore, was not merely a shock. It was an earthquake that fractured the very bedrock of the city's criminal underworld. One crisp autumn evening, after a particularly tense meeting with his inner circle, Don Luciano simply wasn't there. No farewells, no struggle, no body. His polished mahogany desk was clear, save for a single unlit cigar, a silent sentinel to his absence. The whispers began immediately. Some said he'd been taken out by a rival family, a bold move that would surely ignite a bloody war. Others swore he'd been betrayed from within, a viper in his own nest. But the most unsettling theory, the one that truly gnawed at the edges of their sanity, was that he had simply chosen to vanish, to step off the map, to become nothing more than a chilling legend. His closest confidant, a man named Silas the Serpent Moretti, a consigliere whose intellect was as sharp as his tailored suits, was left to navigate the treacherous waters of the power vacuum. Silas was a man of quiet intelligence, a master strategist who understood the intricate dance of power and loyalty within the Ricci family. He was a survivor, a man who had seen many dons rise and fall. But Luciano's disappearance was unprecedented. The lack of a body, the utter absence of any struggle, painted a picture not of murder, but of a calculated vanishing. Silas had observed Luciano for years, noting the don's meticulous planning, his uncanny ability to foresee betrayal, and his deep-seated paranoia. He knew Luciano wasn't a man to be caught unaware, nor was he one to abandon his empire without reason. The more Silas delved into the circumstances of the disappearance, the more he became convinced that Luciano was not dead, but merely elsewhere. He meticulously scoured every inch of the mansion, interviewed every guard, every maid, every driver, searching for a single clue, a stray thread that could unravel the mystery. The silence, however, was absolute, a deafening roar that echoed through the empty halls of the don's home. The only tangible evidence was the uneaten meal on his dining table, still warm, and the single unlit cigar on his desk. It was as if he had simply walked through a hidden door, a portal to another dimension, leaving behind only the ghost of his presence. The city, a beast of 1,000 hungry mouths, began to devour itself. Rival families, sensing weakness, started to chip away at the Ricci empire. Internal factions, once held in check by Luciano's iron fist, began to stir, their ambitions no longer bridled. Silas, with a grim determination, fought to maintain order, to keep the family from tearing itself apart. He knew that the absence of a leader, especially one as formidable as Luciano, was an invitation to chaos, a signal for predators to move in. He kept the search for Luciano alive, a flickering candle in the encroaching darkness, knowing that the truth, whatever it may be, was buried deep, waiting to be unearthed. The 10 years that followed were a testament to Silas's unwavering loyalty and strategic prowess. He held the Ricci family together, a fragile dam against the rising tide of rival ambitions, all the while carrying the heavy burden of the don's unresolved absence. He built an intricate network of informants and spies, always listening for the faintest whisper, the slightest hint that Luciano was still alive, still out there. The city moved on, eventually, forgetting the fear and replacing it with new anxieties, new villains, new heroes. But in the shadowed corners of the underworld, the name Luciano Ricci remained, a ghost story whispered to keep wayward soldiers in line, a chilling reminder that some men never truly disappear. The memory of his silent vanishing lingered like a cold spot in an otherwise warm room, a constant reminder that some mysteries were too profound, too terrifying, to ever be truly solved. The city, bustling and bruised, bore the scars of a decade without its most feared phantom. For 10 years, the name Don Luciano Ricci was spoken in hushed tones, a cautionary tale, a myth, a ghost. But in 1948, the ghost decided it was tired of haunting the shadows. The 7 disappearances were not random. They were a meticulously choreographed re-entry, a brutal announcement of his return. Each woman, plucked from the mundane rhythm of her life, served a specific, twisted purpose. Elena, a waitress at a small Italian diner in Little Italy, was the 7th to vanish. She was a quiet girl, her days a simple cycle of clattering plates, steaming coffee, and the occasional kind word to a regular. Her beauty was not flamboyant, but held a gentle, almost ethereal quality, a stark contrast to the harsh reality of her abduction. One rainy Tuesday evening, as she was wiping down tables after closing. A sleek black sedan pulled up to the curb. Two hulking men in fedoras, their faces obscured by the shadows in the brim of their hats, entered the diner. Their movements were fluid, practiced, their silence more menacing than any threat. Elena felt a prickle of ice down her spine, a primal fear that screamed danger. Before she could utter a sound, a rough hand clamped over her mouth. Another grabbed her arm, and she was swiftly, silently, dragged into the waiting car. Her muffled cries were swallowed by the driving rain, her struggles futile against the brute force of her captors. The last thing she saw before the darkness enveloped her was the diner's neon sign, flickering erratically, casting an ominous red glow on the wet street. The car sped through the city, the journey a blur of fear and disorientation. When it finally stopped, Elena was blindfolded and bundled out, her senses assaulted by the damp, musty smell of earth and decay. She was led down a series of cold stone steps, the echoes of her captor's heavy boots reverberating in the oppressive silence. When the blindfold was finally removed, her eyes, adjusting to the dim light, widened in horror. She was in a vast, subterranean cellar, the air thick with the scent of stale wine and something else, something metallic and foreboding. And there, seated at the head of a long oak table, was a man whose presence filled the cavernous space with an almost tangible dread. Don Luciano Ricci. He was older, his face etched with deeper lines, his hair streaked with silver. But his eyes, those cold, unblinking eyes, held the same chilling intensity, the same predatory gleam that had haunted the city's nightmares for a decade. Beside him, like silent sentinels, stood the other 6 abducted waitresses, their faces pale with terror, their eyes wide and vacant. They were not bound, but their spirits were, held captive by the overwhelming presence of the Don. The scene was a tableau of absolute power and absolute helplessness. Luciano's return was not just an act of abduction. It was a carefully constructed statement, a brutal reassertion of his authority. Each waitress represented a different facet of the city, a different neighborhood, a different social stratum, all now brought under his terrifying sway. He had chosen them not for their connections or wealth, but for their anonymity, their ordinariness. Their disappearance would send a tremor of fear through the everyday lives of New Yorkers, a chilling reminder that no one was safe, that his reach was absolute and indiscriminate. This was not a power play against rival families. This was a declaration of war against the city itself, a re-establishment of a forgotten terror. Elena, despite her fear, felt a spark of defiance flicker within her. She was not a pawn to be played. She was a woman, and she would not break. But as Luciano's gaze fell upon her, a chilling smile playing on his lips, she knew her defiance would be tested in ways she couldn't yet imagine. The true horror was not just being held captive, but being chosen, singled out by a man whose very name was synonymous with darkness. She was now part of his twisted narrative, a silent character in a story she desperately wished she could escape. The cellar, a subterranean chamber beneath an abandoned warehouse in the desolate industrial zone, was a fortress of secrecy. Luciano had meticulously prepared this sanctuary during his decade-long absence, a hidden lair where he could operate beyond the prying eyes of the law and the underworld. The walls were rough-hewn stone, the air perpetually cool and damp, and the only light came from a few flickering gas lamps that cast long, dancing shadows, distorting the faces of the terrified women into grotesque masks of fear. The other 6 waitresses, each a testament to Luciano's chilling precision, were a diverse group. There was Maria, a robust woman with a fiery spirit from a Sicilian family in Queens, her usual boisterous laughter replaced by a trembling silence. Then there was Sarah, a quiet, intellectual girl who worked at a diner near Columbia University, her spectacles askew, her face etched with a silent, profound despair. Each woman, a symbol of ordinary life violently interrupted, served to amplify the horror of Luciano's reemergence. He had chosen them not for their individual attributes, but for their collective anonymity, their utter lack of connection to the criminal underworld. This made their disappearances all the more baffling, all the more terrifying to the general public. Luciano, meanwhile, sat observing them, a king in his dark domain. He didn't speak immediately, allowing the silence and the weight of his presence to settle upon them. to break their wills before he uttered a single word. Elena, despite her profound terror, found herself studying him, searching for a hint of the man beneath the monster. His tailored suit was impeccable. His hands, though strong, were surprisingly delicate, almost artistic. Yet, the coldness in his eyes was absolute, a void where warmth and empathy should have been. She could feel the stares of the other women, their silent questions, their unspoken pleas for help. But there was no help here, only the chilling reality of their captivity and the unfathomable purpose behind it. The lingering question, the one that gnawed at Elena's mind even as fear consumed her, was why her? Why had she, a simple waitress, been singled out from the myriad of women in the city? What twisted game was Luciano playing, and what was her role in it? The answer, when it came, would be more terrifying than she could possibly imagine. The Don's voice, when it finally broke the suffocating silence of the cellar, was surprisingly soft, almost conversational, yet it carried the weight of 1,000 unspoken threats. "Welcome, ladies," he began, a faint, chilling smile playing on his lips. "You are here because destiny, or perhaps a more discerning hand, has chosen you for a very particular purpose." He surveyed them, his gaze lingering on each woman, dissecting their fear, measuring their resilience. Elena felt his eyes on her longest, a chilling sensation that felt like a spider crawling across her skin. "For 10 years, Luciano continued, the city believed I was gone, a ghost in the annals of forgotten history. But ghosts, as you will learn, have a way of returning, especially when they have unfinished business." He then unveiled the horrifying truth. He was searching for a bride. Not a bride of love or affection, but a woman who would bear his heir, a vessel for the continuation of his bloodline. His decade-long absence, he explained with a chilling lack of emotion, was spent in self-imposed exile, recuperating from a near-fatal betrayal, rebuilding his strength, and meticulously planning his return. But during that time, he had come to a grim realization. His bloodline, the very essence of his power, was at risk of extinction. His previous wife had died years prior, and his children, one by one, had proven themselves unworthy, either too weak, too rebellious, or too tainted by the outside world to carry on his legacy. He had culled them, he revealed with a casual shrug, as one might cull a weak crop, leaving no suitable successor. This sudden, brutal act of family cleansing had been the true reason for his disappearance. He needed to eliminate all traces of his past failures before he could re-emerge, fully cleansed and ready to rebuild. He needed a new beginning, a clean slate. And that began with a pure, untainted bloodline. He had chosen waitresses, he explained, because they were ordinary, unnoticed, untainted by the corrupting influence of the city's underworld. They were blank canvases, perfect for his grotesque design. He would observe them, test them, break them, and from their shattered pieces, he would choose the one who possessed the elusive qualities he sought in the mother of his heir. Strength disguised as meekness, a silent resilience, and a spark of defiance that could be molded into absolute loyalty. "One of you," Luciano declared, his voice rising slightly, "will be my queen. The others will serve as a testament to the price of disobedience." The unspoken threat hung heavy in the air, a cold promise of a gruesome fate. Elena's heart pounded against her ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage. She looked at the other women, their faces a mask of terror and despair, and knew that their lives and her own were now forfeit to the Don's twisted whim. The selection process began the following day, a chilling performance orchestrated by Luciano himself. It wasn't a brutal physical trial, not at first. Instead, it was a subtle psychological torture designed to break their spirits, to expose their deepest fears and their most hidden strengths. He would observe them from the shadows, watching how they reacted to mundane tasks, cleaning the cold, damp cellar, preparing simple meals, tending to the meager fire in the hearth. He had his men, silent and menacing, create small, controlled provocations, a spilled bucket of water, a misplaced tool, a deliberately unsettling rumor whispered just within earshot. He sought to gauge their emotional responses, their capacity for resilience, their ability to find order in chaos. Maria, the robust woman from Queens, initially tried to rally the others, her voice booming with defiant anger. But Luciano's men, with a subtle nod from their don, singled her out for extra, unending chores, isolating her, wearing down her fiery spirit until her voice was reduced to a defeated whisper. Sarah, the intellectual, tried to reason with him, to appeal to his logic, his humanity. Luciano merely listened, a cold, amused glint in his eyes, before having her confined to a small, isolated chamber for days, denying her any light or human contact, proving that logic held no sway in his twisted kingdom. Elena, meanwhile, adopted a strategy of quiet observation. She moved with a silent grace, performing her duties diligently but without enthusiasm. She watched the Don, studied his moods, his reactions, trying to decipher the unwritten rules of his game. She saw the flickers of paranoia in his eyes, the almost obsessive need for control, the chilling satisfaction he derived from their fear. She learned that overt defiance was met with swift, crushing retribution, but subtle acts of quiet resistance, of maintaining one's inner dignity, sometimes went unnoticed. One evening, Luciano brought them a simple meal of bread and watery soup. As he watched them eat, he began to recount, in his soft, unsettling voice, tales of his youth, stories of brutal betrayals and ruthless vengeance, painting a vivid picture of the world he inhabited. He didn't seek their sympathy, but their understanding of the absolute, unforgiving nature of his power. He was testing their reactions, their ability to stomach the darkness that defined him. Some women recoiled, their faces pale with disgust. Elena, however, maintained a placid expression, her eyes meeting his for a fleeting moment, a silent acknowledgement of the horrors he described. It was a subtle act of resilience, a refusal to be overtly broken, a quiet defiance that piqued the Don's interest. He recognized in her a hidden strength, a capacity for endurance that he had not seen in the others. He needed a bride who could not only survive his world but thrive in it. A woman who understood the brutal calculus of power without succumbing to outright fear or overt rebellion. The cellar, a stage for his sadistic experiment, continued to hum with a palpable tension. Each day was a step closer to the inevitable, a brutal elimination round where the stakes were life and death. Elena knew she was being watched, her every move scrutinized, her every reaction catalogued. The weight of the Don's gaze was a constant pressure, a reminder that she was merely a specimen, a variable in his terrifying equation. The other women, once a source of potential camaraderie, were now rivals, each fighting for survival in their own desperate way, their eyes filled with a mixture of fear, resentment, and a chilling, nascent desperation. The selection process escalated, morphing from psychological observation into increasingly cruel trials. Don Luciano, with a chilling detachment, began to pit the women against each other. He would leave a single desirable item, a piece of fresh fruit, a warm blanket, in the cellar, observing from the shadows as the women, weakened by hunger and fear, grappled with the primitive urge for self-preservation. He wanted to see who would betray, who would cooperate, and who would simply withdraw into themselves. He watched as the fragile bonds of sisterhood, initially forged in shared terror, began to fray under the pressure. Sarah, the intellectual, tried to share, to reason for cooperation, but the other women, driven by primal instincts, often turned on her, seeing her generosity as a weakness, a ploy. Maria, still defiant but physically worn down, would occasionally lash out, her frustration boiling over in desperate, futile outbursts. Elena, however, maintained her quiet dignity. She rarely engaged in the squabbles, but when an opportunity arose, she would discreetly offer a small comfort to another woman without drawing attention to herself. One frigid morning, the Don entered the cellar with a grim expression. He announced that one of them had committed an act of disrespect, a broken plate, he claimed, though Eleanor suspected it was a fabricated excuse. As punishment, he declared that one of them would face a night in the dark room, a smaller windowless chamber within the cellar, known to be infested with rats. The women gasped, their faces paling further. Luciano then ordered them to choose. The air crackled with a sickening tension. No one dared to speak, their eyes darting between each other, the terror of choosing and being chosen, paralyzing them. Elena felt a surge of nausea, but also a hardening resolve. She watched as fear contorted the faces of the others, as they averted their gazes, unable to condemn one of their own. Then, with a quiet strength that surprised even herself, Elena stepped forward. "I will go," she said, her voice trembling slightly but clear in the heavy silence. "The plate was near my area. I will take the punishment." A collective gasp rippled through the group. Luciano's eyes, which had been cold and impassive, narrowed slightly. A flicker of something akin to intrigue, perhaps even respect, crossing his features. He had expected a struggle, a fight, a desperate attempt to deflect blame. Elena's self-sacrifice was an unexpected variable. He studied her for a long moment. Then, with a curt nod, he gestured to his men. "Take her." The night in the dark room was a crucible. The pervasive darkness, the gnawing cold, and the terrifying scuttling of unseen creatures tested Elena's resolve to its limits. She huddled in a corner, reciting prayers, forcing herself to focus on anything but the terror that threatened to consume her. She thought of her family, her quiet life, the taste of her mother's homemade pasta. She refused to scream, refused to give Luciano the satisfaction of breaking her. When the guards finally opened the door at dawn, Elena emerged, pale and exhausted, but unbroken. Her eyes, though shadowed, held a fierce, unyielding light. She had faced her deepest fears and emerged with her spirit intact. Luciano was there, observing her. He said nothing, merely watched her walk back to the other women, her head held high despite her ordeal. The other waitresses looked at her with a mixture of awe and fear, a silent acknowledgement of her courage. Her act of defiance, her willingness to sacrifice herself, had set her apart. It had shown Luciano a strength he had been searching for, a resilience that hinted at the unwavering loyalty he craved in his queen. This unexpected display of character, this quiet act of courage, sealed her fate in a way she hadn't anticipated. It marked her as the one, the chosen vessel for his terrifying legacy. The next day, there were fewer women in the cellar. Two of the waitresses, weakened by fear and unable to withstand the relentless psychological torment, had been taken away in the night. Luciano made no announcement, offered no explanation, but the chilling message was clear. Only the strongest, the most resilient, would remain. The dwindling numbers only amplified the terror, forcing the remaining women to confront the stark reality of their situation. Elena knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, that her act of self-sacrifice had made her a contender, but also a target. She had proven her strength, but in Luciano's twisted world, that strength was not a ticket to freedom, but a path to a different kind of captivity. She was not merely surviving. She was being groomed, molded into the Don's vision of a suitable bride. The quiet girl who served coffee and pastries was slowly, irrevocably, being transformed into something far more formidable and far more terrifying. The air in the cellar, once filled with the cacophony of shared fear, was now laced with a chilling silence, punctuated only by the soft sobs of the remaining women and the quiet, calculating movements of Luciano's men. Each day was a test, each interaction a trial, and Elena found herself navigating a landscape of shifting alliances and profound betrayals, all while maintaining her carefully constructed facade of quiet resilience. The thought of escape, a desperate flicker in her mind, was always overshadowed by the grim reality of their heavily guarded prison, a fortress beneath the city that had, for a decade, held the ghost of Don Luciano himself. With each passing day, the cellar grew colder, emptier. One by one, the other waitresses disappeared, their absence a silent, chilling testament to Luciano's ruthless selection process. Elena was acutely aware that she was now one of only 2 women remaining. The other was a timid girl named Isabella, whose spirit had been almost entirely extinguished by the ordeal. Isabella spent her days huddled in a corner, weeping silently, her eyes vacant and distant. Elena watched her with a pang of pity, knowing that Isabella, despite her innocence, was merely prolonging her inevitable, gruesome fate. Luciano's gaze, once sweeping across a group, was now focused almost entirely on Elena. He observed her with an almost scientific detachment, analyzing her every movement, her every whispered word, searching for any sign of weakness, any crack in her carefully constructed facade. He began to engage her in short, unsettling conversations, not about the future or their shared predicament, but about mundane topics, the weather, the city, her memories of a life that felt 1,000,000 miles away. He was testing her composure, her ability to maintain a semblance of normalcy in the face of unspeakable horror. Elena, despite the terror that gnawed at her, responded with quiet dignity, her answers brief but respectful, her eyes never betraying the fear that raged within her. One evening, as the gaslights flickered, casting long, dancing shadows on the rough-hewn walls, Luciano summoned Elena to his table. He held a delicate porcelain teacup, sipping slowly, his eyes never leaving her. Isabella, cowering in a distant corner, whimpered softly. "Elena," Luciano began, his voice still soft, but with an underlying edge of authority. "You have shown remarkable resilience, a strength I did not anticipate finding in one so ordinary." His words were a backhanded compliment, a perverse acknowledgement of her courage. "The other women," he continued, gesturing vaguely to the empty chairs, "they lacked your fortitude. They broke. They succumbed to their fears." He paused, his gaze intensifying. "You did not. Why?" Elena swallowed, her throat dry. She knew this was a pivotal moment, a test that could determine her fate. "I have no choice, Don Luciano," she replied, her voice steady despite the tremor in her heart. "To break would be to surrender, and I refuse to surrender my spirit, even if my body is captive." A faint, almost imperceptible smile touched Luciano's lips. It was not a smile of warmth, but of satisfaction, like a predator who had finally cornered its prey. "An admirable sentiment," he murmured. "But surrender is not always a weakness, Elena. Sometimes it is a path to survival." He then revealed his decision. Isabella, he declared, was no longer suitable. Her spirit was broken beyond repair, her will too weak to serve his purpose. Eleanor, however, possessed the very qualities he sought: an unyielding spirit, a quiet defiance, and an inner strength that would ensure his bloodline was strong. "You, Elena," Luciano announced, his voice now imbued with a chilling finality. "You will be my bride." Elena felt a wave of cold dread wash over her, colder and more profound than any fear she had experienced before. It was not a victory, it was a condemnation. She was chosen not for love, but for a terrifying purpose, a vessel for a man she both loathed and feared. Her quiet resilience, her refusal to break, had ironically led her to a fate she never would have imagined. The next morning, Isabella was gone. Elena didn't need to ask where. The cellar, once a space of shared terror, was now a tomb of her hopes. She was utterly alone, save for Luciano and his silent, menacing men. The weight of her new reality pressed down on her, a suffocating shroud of despair. She was to be the Dawn's bride, a captive queen in a kingdom of shadows, her future a terrifying blank canvas painted with the colors of his dark ambition. The preparations for the grotesque wedding began almost immediately. Luciano, ever the meticulous planner, saw it as more than a mere ceremony. It was a symbolic re-establishment of his power, a declaration to the world that he was back, and stronger than ever. The cellar, once a dank prison, was transformed with an unsettling irony. Elaborate tapestries, depicting scenes of ancient Roman conquests, were hung on the rough stone walls, contrasting starkly with the grimy surroundings. A makeshift altar was constructed from salvaged wood, draped in dark, rich velvet. The air, usually heavy with the scent of damp earth, was now infused with the sweet, cloying aroma of incense, masking the lingering hints of fear and decay. Elena, however, felt no joy, no anticipation, only a profound sense of dread. She was given a wedding gown, a beautiful but ironically funereal white silk dress embroidered with intricate lace. As she looked at her reflection in a tarnished mirror, she saw not a bride, but a ghost. Her face pale, her eyes haunted, the gown a stark reminder of her stolen innocence. Her spirit, though not broken, was slowly being chipped away, piece by agonizing piece, by the relentless pressure of her circumstances. She knew she had to find a way out, but the heavy guards, the thick walls of the cellar, and the ever-present watchful gaze of Luciano made escape seem an impossible dream. She was merely a pawn in his game, a symbol of his restored power, a tragic figure in his brutal narrative. The wedding, if one could even call it that, was a macabre spectacle. It took place in the transformed cellar under the flickering glow of gas lamps, illuminating the grim faces of Luciano's inner circle. These were men forged in the fires of loyalty and fear, their suits pressed, their eyes watchful, their presence a silent testament to the Don's renewed power. Silas the Serpent Moretti, Luciano's consigliere, stood beside his Don, his usual calm demeanor strained. Silas had always been a man of logic and strategy, but even he found this forced marriage, this grotesque display, unsettling. He had been a loyal servant during Luciano's decade-long absence, holding the family together, navigating the treacherous waters of the underworld. He had celebrated Luciano's return, seeing it as a restoration of order. But this abduction of innocent women and the forced marriage, it felt different, darker. He saw the cold resolve in Luciano's eyes, a chilling certainty that bordered on madness. Elena, dressed in the beautiful but suffocating white gown, walked down the makeshift aisle, her steps heavy, her heart a leaden weight in her chest. Her face was a mask of stoic resignation, her eyes downcast, refusing to meet the gaze of the assembled men. She was escorted by 2 hulking guards, their presence a stark reminder of her captivity. The ceremony was brief, conducted by a priest whose trembling hands and averted eyes spoke volumes of his unwilling participation. His voice, thin and reedy, hurried through the vows, eager to conclude the blasphemous union. Luciano, his face impassive, repeated his vows with an unnerving calm, his gaze fixed on Elena, a possessive glint in his eyes. Elena, when her turn came, spoke her vows in a whisper, her voice devoid of emotion, a hollow echo in the cavernous cellar. She felt a profound sense of unreality, as if she were an actress in a horrifying play, her lines forced, her movements controlled by an unseen puppeteer. As Luciano placed a heavy gold ring on her finger, she felt a cold dread seep into her bones, a chilling confirmation of her new, terrifying reality. She was now Elena Ricci, the Don's bride, a prisoner in a gilded cage. The celebration that followed was a grim affair. Champagne flowed, but the laughter was forced, the conversations hushed, the atmosphere thick with an unspoken tension. Elena was paraded amongst the guests, her hand clasped firmly by Luciano, a trophy bride, a symbol of his absolute dominion. She could feel the stares, the whispers, the mixture of fear and pity in the eyes of the few women present. She maintained her composure, her head held high, refusing to give them the satisfaction of seeing her break. She understood now that her survival depended not on escape, but on adaptation, on finding a way to navigate this brutal new world without losing herself entirely. Later that night, in a lavishly furnished suite within the hidden depths of the warehouse, Elena stood by the window, staring out into the inky blackness, a stark contrast to the opulence of her surroundings. She was no longer just Elena, the waitress. She was Elena Ricci, the Don's wife, a woman whose life had been violently ripped from her control, her future dictated by the whims of a ruthless man. But even as despair threatened to overwhelm her, a flicker of something else ignited within her. A quiet resolve, a nascent strength that had been forged in the crucible of her captivity. She would not simply survive, she would endure, and in that endurance, she would find a way to reclaim her life, to defy the monster who now called her his wife. Her wedding night was a descent into a new kind of terror, a violation of her very being. Luciano, devoid of tenderness, treated her as a possession, a vessel for his twisted desires. Elena, through sheer force of will, detached herself, her mind floating above her body, observing the scene with a chilling objectivity. She retreated into a fortress of her own making, a place where her spirit could remain untouched, even as her body was defiled. She focused on the small details of the room, the ornate patterns on the wallpaper, the scent of expensive cologne, the distant rumble of the city, a reminder of the world outside her prison. This mental compartmentalization, this ability to separate her mind from her physical reality, became her shield, her only means of survival in the face of such profound violation. She knew that to truly break would be to lose herself entirely, and that was a fate she refused to accept. As the first light of dawn filtered through the heavy curtains, Elena lay in the opulent bed, her body aching, her spirit bruised but not broken. Luciano, oblivious to her internal struggle, slept soundly beside her, his breath even and deep. She carefully, silently slipped out of bed, her movements practiced and deliberate. She walked to the window, pulling back the heavy velvet curtain, and looked out at the waking city. The sky was a pale gray, tinged with the promise of a new, unsettling day. She was the Don's wife, a chilling reality. But she was also Elena, a woman who had faced unimaginable horrors and emerged, not unscathed, but unbroken. A cold, hard resolve settled in her heart. She would play his game. She would endure his monstrous reality, but she would never truly be his. Her mind, her spirit, remained her own, a secret weapon in a war she was only just beginning to understand. She would bide her time. She would observe. She would learn, and when the moment was right, she would exact a revenge as cold and precise as Luciano's own reign of terror. The wedding, far from being the end of her ordeal, was merely the beginning of a new, more dangerous chapter in her life. Elena quickly discovered that her new life as Don Luciano Ricci's wife was a gilded cage, opulent yet suffocating. The hidden warehouse, a sprawling complex that housed not just the cellar but lavish apartments, an armory, and a command center, was her new prison. Guards, silent and ever-present, were her constant companions, their eyes following her every move, their presence a chilling reminder of her captivity. Luciano, surprisingly, was not always overtly cruel. He treated her with a strange, possessive deference, as if she were a precious, fragile artifact. He provided her with the finest clothes, the most exquisite jewels, and access to a library filled with rare books. He encouraged her to read, to learn, to cultivate her mind. But beneath this veneer of generosity lay a deeper, more insidious form of control. He wanted her to be a refined companion, an intelligent confidant, someone who could understand the complexities of his world without ever truly being a part of it, or worse, challenging it. He would spend hours in the library, sometimes reading aloud to her from ancient texts on strategy and power, his voice soft, almost hypnotic, his eyes alight with a disturbing intellectual intensity. He saw her as an extension of himself, a symbol of his renewed status, a testament to his ability to bend the world to his will. Elena, ever observant, used this perverse freedom to her advantage. She immersed herself in the library, devouring books on history, politics, and even military strategy. She listened intently to Luciano's monologues, learning the intricate workings of his criminal empire, the names of his associates, the rivalries that simmered beneath the surface, the unwritten rules that governed his brutal world. She discovered that Luciano's decade-long absence had not been one of quiet reflection, but of relentless planning and consolidation. He had amassed a vast fortune in South America, building new connections, refining his strategies, and waiting for the opportune moment to reassert his dominance. His return to New York was not merely a whim, it was a calculated move, a precisely timed strike to reclaim what he believed was rightfully his. She learned that Silas, his consigliere, was the linchpin of his operations, a man whose loyalty was absolute, whose intellect was as formidable as the Don's own. Silas, though outwardly subservient, was the only man Luciano truly trusted, the only one allowed to question his decisions, albeit subtly. He was the quiet strength behind the Don's brutal ambition, the architect of his empire's resurgence. Elena observed the subtle dynamics between Luciano and Silas, noting the moments of unspoken communication, the shared glances, the quiet understanding that passed between them. She knew that to challenge Luciano directly would be suicidal. Her only path to survival, and perhaps even escape, lay in understanding the intricate web of power that bound them all. She began to subtly probe Silas, engaging him in quiet conversations when Luciano was absent, feigning an interest in the Don's business, asking seemingly innocuous questions about the family's history, its rivalries, its vulnerabilities. Silas, always guarded, initially offered polite but vague answers. However, Elena's intelligence and genuine curiosity slowly began to chip away at his reserve. He saw in her not just the Don's wife, but a woman of keen intellect, a potential asset. He revealed small details, pieces of information that Elena meticulously catalogued in her mind, building a mental map of Luciano's empire, its strengths and its hidden weaknesses. She understood that her only weapon against Luciano was knowledge, and she would acquire it at any cost. Her seemingly docile acceptance of her role, her quiet studiousness, was merely a carefully constructed facade, a strategic deception designed to lull Luciano and his men into a false sense of security. She was not merely a prisoner, she was a spy, an unwilling agent operating deep within the heart of the enemy's stronghold, slowly gathering the intelligence that would one day lead to her liberation, or perhaps to his downfall. She learned of the family's brutal history, the infamous Valentine's Day massacre that had cemented Luciano's father's power, the subtle art of persuasion that kept rival families in line, and the horrifying fates of those who dared to defy the Ricci name. Elena realized that Luciano's coldness was not merely a personality trait, but a legacy, a deep-seated pathology inherited from generations of ruthless power. The more she learned, the more terrifying her situation became, but also the more focused her resolve. She saw the city through new eyes, not as a place of refuge, but as a vast chessboard where powerful men moved their pieces, and she, for now, was merely a pawn, waiting for her moment to strike. Elena's subtle probing of Silas began to yield significant dividends. She cultivated a relationship with the consigliere based on intellectual curiosity, presenting herself as a keen learner, eager to understand the complex world of her husband. Silas, a man who rarely encountered intellectual equals within the Ricci family, found himself subtly drawn to Elena's quiet intelligence. He saw her as a potential conduit, someone who could temper Luciano's more extreme impulses, perhaps even a future strategist for the family, albeit one under the Don's absolute control. He began to confide in her, not overtly, but in veiled metaphors and historical anecdotes that, to Elena's perceptive mind, revealed crucial details about Luciano's past and present operations. He spoke of the Don's initial disappearance in 1938, hinting at a betrayal from within that had almost cost Luciano his life. He recounted how Luciano, weakened and vulnerable, had been forced to flee, leaving behind his empire and his family, a secret known only to Silas. The Don, Silas mused one afternoon as they sat in the library, surrounded by leather-bound tomes, has always valued loyalty above all else. A viper in the nest, you see, can bring down even the strongest eagle. He spoke of a rival family, the Morettis, no relation to Silas, who had capitalized on Luciano's absence, seizing control of key territories and alliances. He also alluded to the growing discontent among some of Luciano's older capos, men who remembered the decade of uncertainty and viewed Luciano's abrupt return and his drastic methods with a mixture of awe and unease. Elena meticulously pieced together the fragments of information. She understood that Luciano's decade-long exile was not just for recovery, but for vengeance. He was not merely rebuilding his empire, he was meticulously dismantling the new order, punishing those who had dared to rise in his absence. She discovered that a critical ledger, containing the true financial dealings and hidden assets of the Ricci family, had gone missing during Luciano's initial vanishing. This ledger, Silas explained with a rare hint of vulnerability, was the bedrock of the family's legitimate fronts and hidden wealth, and its absence was a constant source of anxiety for Luciano. Its recovery was paramount to securing his complete financial dominance. The ledger was believed to be in the hands of a retired bookkeeper, a man named Angelo "the Numbers" Rossi, who had fled the city in terror after Luciano's disappearance, fearing retribution for perceived disloyalty. He was now living under an assumed name in a small, isolated town upstate. Elena also learned of a secret network of tunnels beneath the warehouse, a labyrinthine system that Luciano had engineered for quick escapes and clandestine meetings. These tunnels, accessible only through hidden panels and reinforced doors, were the Don's ultimate safeguard, his final line of defense against betrayal or invasion. They represented not just an escape route, but a testament to Luciano's profound paranoia. Silas, in a rare moment of unguarded conversation, admitted that Luciano's methods, particularly the abduction of the waitresses, were a source of disquiet among some of the older, more traditional members of the family. The old ways, Silas sighed. They had a certain honor, even in their brutality. This new chapter, it lacks the finesse. This admission was a critical crack in Silas's stoic facade, revealing a hint of moral discomfort, a chink in the armor of his absolute loyalty. Elena seized on this, subtly reinforcing Silas's unspoken concerns, planting seeds of doubt without ever directly criticizing Luciano. She spoke of the unpredictable nature of fear, how it could backfire, creating enemies where loyalty was once assured. She carefully nudged Silas towards a realization that Luciano's ruthlessness, while effective in the short term, could ultimately destabilize the very empire he sought to rebuild. The pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place. Elena understood that to truly escape, she needed more than just an opportunity. She needed leverage, a way to dismantle Luciano's power from within. The missing ledger, the disgruntled Capos, and Silas's subtle misgivings were all potential avenues. She recognized that Luciano's weakness lay not in his power, but in his absolute reliance on control, his profound paranoia, and his chilling lack of empathy. Her strategy began to solidify. She would use the information she had gathered to create an irreversible fissure in his empire, to turn his own strengths into his greatest weaknesses, and to ultimately orchestrate his downfall. The true game, she realized with a cold clarity, was not about survival, but about vengeance, a reckoning that would free not only herself, but the city from the shadow of Don Luciano Ricci. The weight of this realization was both terrifying and exhilarating. She was no longer just a victim, she was a player, a silent architect of Luciano's potential ruin, operating in the heart of his dark domain. The opportunity Elena had been waiting for presented itself during a tumultuous period for the Ricci family. Luciano, emboldened by his perceived successes, decided to make a dramatic move against the Moretti family, the rivals who had risen in his absence. He orchestrated a series of brutal, highly visible attacks on Moretti businesses, sending a clear, unequivocal message of his resurgence. This campaign, however, proved to be more aggressive than strategic, stirring up a hornet's nest of retaliation. The city's underworld erupted in a cascade of violence, rivalries flaring, loyalties shifting, the fragile peace shattered by Luciano's relentless pursuit of vengeance. The Don became increasingly preoccupied, his attention consumed by the escalating war. He spent long hours in the command center, barking orders, poring over maps, his paranoia reaching a fever pitch. This preoccupation, ironically, created small windows of opportunity for Elena. The guards, though still present, were slightly less vigilant, their focus diverted by the constant threats and skirmishes. Silas, under immense pressure, found himself relying more and more on Elena's quiet intelligence, her keen observations, her ability to analyze situations with a detached, almost strategic mind. He would often discuss the ongoing conflict with her, seeking her perspective on rival movements, on the shifting alliances. He trusted her discretion, believing her to be merely a sharp-witted observer, incapable of actual intervention. Elena capitalized on this. During these discussions, she subtly steered Silas towards certain vulnerabilities, pointing out the strained resources, the overstretched defenses, the growing discontent among some of Luciano's long-serving capos who were weary of the endless violence. She subtly planted the idea that the Moretti family, despite their initial resistance, might be open to a less destructive resolution if approached correctly, implying that Luciano's all-out war was not only costly, but ultimately self-defeating. She knew that the missing ledger, still in Angelo Rossi's possession, was a critical piece of leverage. If the ledger could be recovered and its contents revealed to the right people, it could expose Luciano's illicit financial dealings, unraveling his legitimate fronts and crippling his power. But reaching Rossi, a recluse living in fear, was a formidable challenge. Elena needed an intermediary, someone who could be trusted, someone who understood the intricate dance of the underworld but harbored no allegiance to Luciano. She thought of a name Silas had casually mentioned: Vincenzo the Whisper Gallo, a retired fixer, a man of quiet influence, known for his discretion and his unwavering code of honor. He had once been a close associate of Luciano's father, but had retired from the life after a personal tragedy, maintaining a strict neutrality in the ongoing power struggles. She knew Gallo was a long shot, but he represented her only hope. She found a moment when Luciano was engrossed in a late-night meeting with his capos, their voices muffled by the thick walls. Silas, exhausted and preoccupied, was in his office, reviewing intelligence reports. Elena, feigning a need for a specific book, entered the library, then subtly slipped a handwritten note into a book she knew Silas would pick up later. The note contained a coded message, a request for a private meeting with Gallo, delivered with the utmost secrecy. It appealed not to Gallo's loyalty to the Ricci family, but to his sense of balance and his rumored desire to see a return to the old ways, hinting at the chaos Luciano had wrought. The note was a gamble, a desperate plea, but it was Elena's first active step towards dismantling her prison. She knew that if her plan failed, if Silas discovered her deception, her life would be forfeit. But the stakes were too high to remain a passive prisoner. She was no longer just a pawn. She was making her own moves, setting her own traps, drawing her own connections in the dark tapestry of the underworld. The fate of her freedom, and perhaps the very future of the city, now rested on the fragile thread of a whispered message and the unpredictable response of a retired man of honor. The tension in the hidden warehouse was palpable. Elena's heart pounded with a mixture of fear and adrenaline as she waited for Silas's reaction, for the slightest sign that he had discovered her covert message. Every glance, every hushed conversation, felt amplified, scrutinized. She continued her facade of docile observation, but beneath the surface, a frantic calculation was underway. She knew that Silas, for all his intellect, was deeply loyal to the Ricci family, and any hint of betrayal would be met with swift, brutal consequences. She rehearsed her alibi, her explanations, her denials, bracing herself for the inevitable confrontation. The following morning, Silas approached her in the library, his expression unreadable. He held the book in his hand, his finger marking the page where her note had been hidden. Elena's breath caught in her throat. "Elena," he said, his voice quiet. "I found this." He opened the book, revealing the note. "What is the meaning of this?" His eyes, usually placid, held a sharp, dangerous glint. Elena, with a composure that surprised even herself, met his gaze. "It is a plea, Silas," she began, her voice steady. "A plea for the family's future, for the city's future. Don Luciano's methods, while effective in short bursts, are destabilizing. This endless war, the public's fear, it will only lead to greater scrutiny, greater opposition. Vincenzo Gallo, he is a man of honor. He could be a bridge, a way to mediate, to return to a more balanced approach." She paused, choosing her words carefully. "Luciano trusts you, Silas. He values your counsel, but he is also consumed by his need for vengeance. Perhaps with Gallo's subtle influence we could find a path that protects the family's interests without destroying the very foundation it stands upon." Silas listened, his expression softening almost imperceptibly. He recognized the truth in her words, the fears he himself harbored. He respected Gallo, remembered his wisdom, and knew that Luciano's current path was indeed fraught with peril. He also saw the genuine concern in Elena's eyes, a concern he interpreted as loyalty to the family, not outright betrayal of Luciano. He was torn between his unwavering loyalty to the Don and his growing unease with Luciano's recklessness. After a long, tense silence, Silas slowly nodded. "I will arrange the meeting," he said, his voice low. "But if this is a trick, Elena, know that I will not hesitate to deliver you to the Don myself." It was not a promise, but a chilling warning. Elena felt a surge of relief, followed by a fresh wave of fear. She had succeeded in her first, crucial step, but the path ahead was still fraught with unimaginable danger. She had gained a precarious ally, but at a cost. The game was far from over, and her life still hung by the thinnest of threads. The clandestine meeting with Vincenzo the Whisper Gallo was orchestrated with an almost cinematic precision. Silas, utilizing his extensive network, arranged for Elena to be taken, under heavy guard, but in relative secrecy, to a nondescript warehouse on the outskirts of Brooklyn, far from Luciano's immediate sphere of influence. The location was chosen for its anonymity and its strategic distance, ensuring that Luciano's ever-watchful eyes would not detect the unsanctioned rendezvous. Elena arrived in a plain sedan, the guards grim-faced and silent, their weapons concealed but present. The warehouse was cold and vast, the air thick with the smell of dust and forgotten commerce. In the center of the cavernous space, illuminated by a single bare bulb, sat Vincenzo Gallo. He was an older man, his face a roadmap of hard-won experience, his eyes sharp and intelligent, despite the weariness that shadowed them. He wore a simple, well-worn suit, a stark contrast to the opulence and menace of Luciano's world. Silas stood a respectful distance away, his posture tense, his gaze constantly sweeping the shadows, ensuring their privacy. Elena approached Gallo cautiously, her heart pounding. She knew this was her chance, her only chance to turn the tide. She began by recounting her abduction, her forced marriage, and the chilling realization that Luciano's resurgence was not about justice, but about a terrifying, personal vendetta. She then spoke of Luciano's increasingly erratic behavior, his escalating war with the Morettis, and the growing instability he was bringing to the entire city. She painted a picture of a man consumed by paranoia and a twisted vision of control, a man who threatened to unravel the delicate balance of the underworld, bringing unwanted attention from the law and public scrutiny. Don Luciano, Elena explained, her voice gaining strength. He is no longer the man who commanded respect, even fear, with strategy and cunning. He is a ghost, driven by vengeance, blinded by his own hubris. He will bring ruin not just to the Morettis, but to everyone, including his own family. She then presented her crucial piece of leverage, the missing ledger. She explained that its contents, if revealed, would expose Luciano's true financial vulnerabilities, his hidden networks, and his illicit dealings, crippling his ability to wage war and sustain his empire. Angelo Rossi, she revealed. He holds the key. He has the ledger, and he is living in fear. But he is also a man of integrity, a man who believes in balance. If approached by someone he trusts, someone who can offer him protection, he might be convinced to reveal the truth. She appealed to Gallo's sense of honor, to his desire for a return to the old ways, to a time when disputes were settled with a semblance of order, not with indiscriminate brutality. She argued that Luciano's reign of terror was an affront to the very principles of the underworld, a reckless gamble that endangered everyone. Gallo listened in silence, his expression unreadable, his eyes fixed on Elena. He had heard whispers of Luciano's erratic behavior, of the growing unrest within the Ricci family, but Elena's first-hand account, her raw honesty, resonated deeply. He had known Luciano's father, a man who, despite his ruthlessness, adhered to a certain code. Luciano's current path, he realized, was indeed a dangerous deviation. After a long, tense silence, Gallo finally spoke, his voice a low rumble. "You are a brave woman, Elena Ricci. Too brave for this life, perhaps." He looked at Silas, a silent question passing between them. Silas, though his face remained impassive, gave a subtle, almost imperceptible nod. He, too, was convinced that Luciano's path was leading to ruin. "I will contact Rossi," Gallo finally declared, his voice firm. "But this is a dangerous game you are playing, Elena. If Luciano discovers your involvement, there will be no place in this city safe for you." It was a warning, but also a promise. Elena had found her ally, her lifeline. But she knew that the confrontation that lay ahead would be more perilous than anything she had imagined. She had successfully planted the seeds of doubt, forged a precarious alliance, and set in motion a chain of events that would either lead to her freedom or her ultimate demise. The game was intensifying, the stakes rising with every calculated move. The very existence of Luciano's empire and Elena's life now hung precariously in the balance. The air in the warehouse crackled with the weight of their unspoken understanding. Elena felt a surge of both hope and trepidation. She had crossed a line, irrevocably changing her status from victim to player. She knew that Gallo, a man of his word, would act, and that action would inevitably set her on a collision course with Luciano. The thought of confronting the Don, of facing his wrath, sent a shiver of fear down her spine. But it was quickly replaced by a fierce, unyielding resolve. She had endured his cruelty, suffered his violations, and now she would be the instrument of his downfall. The true reckoning, she realized, was about to begin. The plan was set in motion. Vincenzo Gallo, utilizing his old-world connections and his reputation for absolute discretion, managed to locate Angelo Rossi. He approached the retired bookkeeper not with threats, but with a promise of protection and an appeal to his conscience. Rossi, weary of a decade spent in hiding and haunted by the knowledge he possessed, eventually agreed to cooperate, but under one condition. His safety had to be guaranteed, and Luciano Ricci had to be permanently neutralized. Gallo, with Silas's subtle assistance, meticulously arranged for Rossi to meet with a trusted neutral party, a powerful, incorruptible judge known for his unwavering commitment to justice, but also for his deep understanding of the city's complex underworld. The judge, a man named Justice Theodore Caldwell, was an unlikely ally, but Gallo knew Caldwell's quiet disdain for Luciano's brutal methods. The meeting took place in a secluded, heavily guarded safe house, far from the prying eyes of the Ricci family. Rossi, a nervous wreck but resolute, presented the ledger to Judge Caldwell. The contents were more damning than anyone had imagined. It meticulously detailed Luciano's vast illicit network, his hidden accounts, his extensive money laundering operations, and, most damningly, a comprehensive list of his corrupt officials, his bought politicians, and his secret allies within the police force. It was a blueprint of Luciano's entire empire, a ticking time bomb waiting to explode. Simultaneously, Elena, under the guise of intellectual curiosity, continued to subtly plant seeds of dissent among Luciano's weary capos. She spoke of the mounting losses in the war against the Morettis, the dwindling resources, and the relentless pressure from the authorities. She hinted at Luciano's growing paranoia, his isolation, and his increasing reliance on ruthless young enforcers who lacked the wisdom and loyalty of the old guard. She didn't openly criticize Luciano, but her words painted a picture of a Don whose methods were leading them all to ruin. She emphasized that the old ways of honor and strategic patience were being replaced by reckless aggression, and that the family was suffering for it. The capos, already disillusioned and fearful for their own skins, began to murmur among themselves, their discontent growing into a palpable unrest. They remembered the stability of Luciano's father's reign, the measured brutality that ensured prosperity without constant warfare. This new Luciano, returned from the dead, was a force of chaos, and they were tired of being caught in his destructive wake. They longed for a return to order, to the predictability of the old world. The stage was set for the ultimate confrontation. Judge Caldwell, armed with the ledger, issued a series of secret indictments, targeting Luciano's key figures and his legitimate businesses. The net was cast wide and deep, designed to cripple Luciano's empire from the top down. The plan was to execute a coordinated raid, a swift and decisive strike that would leave Luciano isolated and exposed. Silas, however, was facing his own internal conflict. His loyalty to Luciano, a bond forged over decades, was being severely tested. He had seen the truth in Elena's words, the undeniable evidence of Luciano's self-destructive path. He knew that if he continued to stand by Luciano, he would go down with the ship. But betraying the Don, even for the greater good of the family, was an act of profound treachery, a violation of his life's code. He paced his office late into the night, the weight of his decision pressing down on him. He remembered Luciano as a young man, ruthless but brilliant, a force of nature. But the decade of exile, the betrayal, had twisted him, turning him into a monstrous caricature of his former self. Silas realized that his loyalty was no longer to the man, but to the legacy, to the stability of the Ricci family itself. And Luciano, in his current state, was a threat to that very stability. He finally made his choice. He would provide the authorities with the precise layout of the hidden warehouse, including the intricate network of tunnels, ensuring a clean, effective raid that would minimize casualties and maximize the chances of capturing Luciano alive.
He knew the risks, the profound personal cost of his actions, but he saw no other way to save what remained of the Ricci family from self-destruction. The storm was gathering, its thunder ready to break. Luciano, oblivious to the meticulously laid trap, continued his relentless war against the Morettis, convinced of his imminent victory.
He had underestimated Elena, underestimated the quiet intelligence of Silas, and critically, underestimated the deep-seated desire for order that simmered beneath the city's chaotic surface. The reckoning was at hand, and it would be swift, brutal, and utterly transformative. The night of the raid was a blur of calculated chaos. Under the cover of a dense, suffocating fog that rolled in from the harbor, a combined force of federal agents and a hand-picked, incorruptible squad of local police descended upon Luciano's hidden warehouse. Their movements were precise, coordinated by the detailed schematics provided by Silas. The main entrance was breached simultaneously with strategic entry points to the subterranean tunnels, designed to cut off Luciano's escape routes. Inside, Luciano, engrossed in a late-night war council with his remaining loyal capos, was taken completely by surprise. The air, thick with cigar smoke and the scent of expensive whiskey, was suddenly shattered by the shouts of law enforcement and the splintering of wood as the doors were blown in. Panic erupted. His capos, once formidable, scattered like startled rats, grabbing weapons, scrambling for cover. Luciano, however, remained unnervingly calm, his eyes scanning the room, assessing the situation with a chilling clarity. He barked orders, his voice cutting through the pandemonium, directing his men to the pre-planned escape routes through the labyrinthine tunnels. Elena, who had been confined to her lavish suite, heard the distant commotion, the shouts, the muffled gunfire. Her heart pounded in her chest, a mixture of terror and exhilarating anticipation. She knew this was it. She waited, listening intently, knowing that her moment to act would come. Silas, meanwhile, positioned himself strategically in the command center, feigning a desperate attempt to organize a counterattack, all while subtly guiding the authorities to Luciano's most vital points of resistance. He knew that the line between hero and traitor was razor-thin, and he walked it with a grim determination. As the raid intensified, Luciano, realizing the overwhelming force against him, decided to activate his final escape plan. He grabbed a satchel containing emergency cash and documents, and with a small contingent of loyal bodyguards, he disappeared into a hidden panel behind his desk, leading to a concealed section of the tunnels. He intended to resurface in a safe house across the city, to regroup and plan his vengeance, but he had not accounted for Silas's thoroughness. The tunnel system, his ultimate safeguard, was now his ultimate trap. As Luciano and his men navigated the twisting, damp passages, they found their path blocked by federal agents who had been waiting for them, their flashlights cutting through the oppressive darkness. A brief, brutal shootout ensued in the confined space. Luciano, cornered and desperate, fought with a ferocity born of a cornered animal. He dispatched 2 agents with surprising speed, his years of ruthless survival instincts kicking in. But the numbers were against him. One by one, his bodyguards fell. Finally, with a desperate roar of defiance, Luciano found himself face to face with a squad of federal agents, their weapons trained on him. He raised his own pistol, a look of pure, unadulterated rage on his face. But before he could fire, a flashbang grenade exploded at his feet, disorienting him. When his vision cleared, he found himself surrounded, his pistol kicked away, his arms twisted behind his back. He was finally captured, brought to his knees, his empire crumbling around him. In her suite, Elena heard the distant sirens fading, the shouts subsiding, replaced by the heavy silence of aftermath. She knew it was over. She cautiously opened her door, making her way through the now desolate warehouse, stepping over debris and abandoned weapons. She found Silas in the command center, his face streaked with grime, his eyes weary but resolute. He looked at her, a silent acknowledgement passing between them. "It's done," he said, his voice hoarse. "He's captured." Elena felt a surge of profound relief, a lightness she hadn't experienced in years. But it was quickly followed by a sense of emptiness. The ordeal was over, but the scars remained, etched deep into her soul. Luciano was taken away in a heavily armored vehicle, his face a mask of silent fury, his eyes still burning with an unquenchable rage. The city would breathe a collective sigh of relief, unaware of the quiet waitress who had played such a pivotal role in bringing down its most feared phantom. The warehouse, once a symbol of his terrifying power, was now a tomb, its secrets laid bare, its darkness finally dispelled. Elena knew that her journey was far from over. She had survived, but she also bore witness to the depths of human cruelty and the complex, terrifying dance of power. She would carry the weight of her experiences, but she would also carry the quiet strength she had found within herself, a resilience forged in the crucible of her captivity. The immediate aftermath of Don Luciano Ricci's capture was a flurry of activity, a calculated cover-up designed to protect the integrity of the law enforcement agencies involved and to maintain the fragile peace of the city. Justice Caldwell, with Silas's continued cooperation, meticulously orchestrated the official narrative. The 7 waitresses, including Elena, were officially listed as victims of a missing persons investigation, their abduction linked to a rouge criminal element that had been swiftly neutralized. No mention was made of a forced marriage, of the psychological torture, or of Elena's pivotal role in Luciano's downfall. The official story was a clean, sanitized version, designed for public consumption, carefully crafted to avoid panic and to protect the sensitive details of the underground operation that had brought down the Don. Elena, along with the other surviving waitresses, 2 of whom had been found alive in other hidden locations during the raid, traumatized but physically unharmed, was provided with new identities, new lives in distant cities. They were given substantial financial compensation, a silent acknowledgement of their suffering, and a means to start anew. Elena, however, chose to remain. She had survived, she had fought, and she refused to be erased. She settled in a quiet neighborhood, far from the shadows of the underworld, her past a carefully guarded secret. She opened a small bakery, the smell of fresh bread and sweet pastries a comforting contrast to the stale cigar smoke and fear of her past. She lived a quiet life, rebuilding herself, piece by agonizing piece. Silas, too, disappeared from the public eye. He went into a self-imposed exile, his loyalty to Luciano finally broken, his conscience clear. He vanished into the quiet anonymity of a small coastal town, living out his days in solitude, forever haunted by the choices he had made, the line he had crossed. The Ricci family, crippled by Luciano's capture and the exposure of the ledger, quickly fractured. Its remaining members, stripped of their power and resources, either scattered or were absorbed by rival factions. The empire that Luciano had so ruthlessly sought to rebuild crumbled, replaced by a new, more fragmented underworld. For years, the legend of Don Luciano Ricci persisted, a chilling ghost story whispered in the city's dark corners. Some said he had died in prison, others that he had orchestrated another impossible escape. The official narrative, carefully constructed by the authorities, was accepted by the public. But those in the know, those who remembered the tremor of fear his return had ignited, knew there was more to the story. Decades passed. The city healed, its scars fading into the collective memory. The legend of Don Luciano Ricci became a relic, a chilling footnote in the annals of organized crime. Elena, now an elderly woman, lived a peaceful life, her bakery a beloved institution in her neighborhood. She carried the weight of her past, the memories of the cellar, the terrifying presence of Luciano, but she had found a way to live with them, to transform her trauma into a quiet strength. One crisp autumn afternoon, a young, ambitious historian named Dr. Evelyn Reed, known for her groundbreaking research into forgotten crime families, stumbled upon a dusty, long-forgotten box in the archives of the New York Public Library. Inside, amidst a collection of old newspaper clippings and police reports from the 1940s, she found a small, meticulously crafted wooden box. It was unmarked, unassuming, almost overlooked. Upon opening it, she discovered a single, elegant silver locket. It was tarnished with age, but its intricate design still hinted at a forgotten beauty. Inside the locket, nestled within its delicate frame, was a faded sepia-toned photograph of a young woman with a quiet, determined gaze, her face hauntingly familiar from the grainy newspaper images of the abducted waitresses. And beneath the photograph, a single cryptic inscription was etched into the silver. E.R. Not a bride, but a warrior. Dr. Reed felt a jolt of recognition. She had read about Elena, the quiet waitress who had survived the Don's reign. But her story, like so many others, had been overshadowed by the official narrative. This locket, this secret inscription, was a profound piece of forgotten evidence, a silent testament to a hidden truth. It hinted at a defiance, a strength, a hidden role that went far beyond the official reports. It was not a memento of a forced marriage, but a symbol of a fierce internal battle fought and won. The locket was a whisper from the past, a tangible link to a story that had been deliberately obscured, a powerful challenge to the accepted history. It proved that the legend of Luciano Ricci and the quiet heroism of Elena were more intertwined, more complex, and ultimately, far more terrifying than anyone had ever truly known. Dr. Reed, holding the locket in her trembling hand, realized that the official narrative was just a shadow, a carefully constructed illusion. The true story of Don Luciano Ricci, the 7 waitresses, and the quiet woman who brought him down, was far darker, far more compelling, and far more steeped in the forbidden history of the city. The locket, a small, unassuming artifact, was a beacon, illuminating the true nature of Elena's journey, revealing her not as a passive victim, but as a silent warrior, a courageous woman who had dared to defy the monster who called her his bride. It was a secret, whispered across decades, confirming that some legends were indeed real, and some heroes chose to remain in the shadows, their battles fought in the quiet chambers of their own hearts. It left Dr. Reed, and by extension the audience, with a haunting question. How many other untold stories, how many other quiet acts of heroism lay buried beneath the carefully constructed narratives of history, waiting to be unearthed? The discovery of the locket was not just an archaeological find. It was a resurrection of a truth that had been too dangerous, too unsettling, to ever be fully revealed. It was a testament to Eleanor's enduring spirit, a final, poignant act of defiance against the man who had tried to erase her very identity. And it left an undeniable, chilling thought lingering in the air. The shadows of the past, however deeply buried, always find a way to resurface, reminding us that the truth, no matter how inconvenient, can never truly be silenced.